Welcome to the Imperfect Citizens podcast with me, Simon Duffy, and
Glyn Butcher.
Glyn and I. Well, today, Glyn, I think we're going to talk about neighbourhoods, aren't we?
Yes, neighbours. What does it mean to be in a neighbourhood? What does a neighbourhood look like? What is neighbourhood democracy? I think this examining what we think when we look at the concept of neighbourhoods and what images and dreams and songs we think about neighbours.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, uh, yeah, so I started thinking about this a while ago. I remember, like, actually, what I really remember is going back to the time. Do you know? Have I told you about this, Glyn? When back in the late 90s, I set up an organisation called Inclusion Glasgow.
Yes.
And this was part of an attempt to get people with learning difficulties, people actually with very complex disabilities. Sometimes the labels like challenging behaviour stuck on them. And we were getting them out of this big institution called Lennox Castle Hospital. 650 people in the institution when we started that. And we were getting 50 people out. And what we were doing was helping people be citizens. So it's very radical, really, still radical today, because we said everybody would live in their own home, everybody would have their own support, everybody would have their own budget, everybody would have their own life. Nobody would be forced to live with other people in a group. You would just have the same rights as other citizens. And so really nobody was doing anything like that at that time.
When I looked at telly, though, everything I see around Scotland, even at that time, there weren't any communities or neighbourhoods there. Every time visually through social media and films, it always about it all being run down. Is that how it were then?
I think that, yeah, no, but I mean, that is part of the story. And certainly there were big parts of Glasgow that, there was the, these these slums that had actually been created out of slum clearances. So Easter House was a very famous one where you went to Easter House, which I did a few times, and you would drive in, and I mean, you'd never seen a social services department like the social services department in Easter House. It was built like a military bunker in the centre of this whole new town. You imagine, like,
Yeah, yeah,
really, it was like had almost a moat round it,
yeah.
and so you they did do a terrible job of basically at the end of the war closing down or shutting down, demolishing places that people lived where there was a lot of community, and then moving people out into these new towns that they built on the edge of Glasgow. Um, and Yeah, so I don't think it's true to say there was no community. In fact, if you went to Glasgow, it was one place where you could be guaranteed to find quite a lot of community in a funny way. But a lot of the communities were very poor.
I suppose what I'm looking at when I was growing up is that everybody seemed to be drunking in Scotland, or I'm thinking about the film Train Spotting where we're in
Right?
ghettos with
Yeah.
drugs and things like that. Or there were a programme when I was growing up about 6 or 7, something about islands. So in Scotland, that everybody lived that far away from each other, there weren't any communities. I suppose that what my concepts of
Yeah,
community
yeah.
in
I
Scotland.
think a lot of things we get see through media is really distorts things. There were certainly some big social problems, and some of those social problems still exist in Glasgow. But you go to those Scottish communities, and actually, yes, small communities, but they were real communities. People supported each other. People knew each other,
Mm.
and so I don't think it's in films about Scotland are a bit like films about the north of England. They're full of stereotypes, aren't they?
Mhm. Oh yeah, yeah,
But
Braveheart, another one. Yeah, I grew up with Braveheart, and again, when I think about neighbours, I used to run home from school and watch Neighbours. So I thought Neighbours was something in Scotland, sorry, in Australia, because when I was growing up, it were always Neighbours you went
yeah.
home from school.
Wait,
So
and what I suppose what struck me when I was doing this work in Glasgow was that Glasgow was a very big place, and we were trying to build community. We were helping people be citizens, but we couldn't really do the work of community because you're basically moving people into a city with over 1 million population, and so that all the people we were supporting, they would have their own home, but we as a little support organization were very disconnected from the community.
that's the difference.
And I think that one of the things I kind of regretted about the model was that so we were ending up supporting people in the east of Glasgow, the west of Glasgow, the north of Glasgow, the south of Glasgow. That's massive. You could spend 45 minutes driving from one part of Glasgow to another very easily.
What did that disconnect feel like? Because you just said it felt disconnected. What did it
Well, I
actually?
think sometimes it felt like I'm a middle class man getting out of my little Ford Fiesta and going into other people's homes in communities I didn't know. Just to me, it felt like I'm a stranger.
Outsider, right?
Yeah,
An
and
outsider.
and I had good relationships with a lot of folk, and I loved working in Glasgow, and people were very positive. There were people were mostly pleased that their sons, daughters, or they themselves were being offered the chance to have a real decent shot at life again. That they were out of this hellhole and they were into somewhere where they could do something real with their lives. But I did feel like, as a support organization, we missed a trick by being so stretched. I think we were tiny and we're stretched. And I felt like actually what we were doing was focusing on creating really person-centered supports, but they weren't community-centered supports.
Right,
You know what
right.
I mean?
Yes, different. Yeah.
So for me, I've always felt there's like a little bit of a tension sometimes between being really person-centered and being community-centered. We need both. Don't get me wrong. I think we did really important work, but we also need to be thinking about the communities themselves that people are in. So that for me was part of my journey towards what I'm doing now a lot is, as you know, when you're doing it too, thinking a lot about neighborhoods. But
But
I started more thinking about the person.
one thing I learned about community and neighbours is that your community might not be your community that you live in. It's the community that you run to every morning. It's the neighbourhood that you flourish in. It's the neighbourhood that you thrive in. So I may live in Rotherham, but I don't count that as my neighbourhood or my community. I count as intake my community in my neighbourhood, the place that I'll thrive in, the place that I work in on a daily basis,
Yeah.
the heart the place that my heart skips a beat to run to every morning.
It's a loss though, isn't it? If we've got everybody, if the community you live in isn't really your community, and I think that's true for a lot of people, and it's a truth, but it's also a loss, isn't it? That we're missing something when the communities where we live, where we wake up, even if we're not running there, but we wake up there and we don't really feel connected, then we've got a kind of bit of a social problem. If there's more and more people feeling like that, then the place itself has got nobody to love it.
I suppose again, I was forced out of my neighbourhood by no fault of my own. I was meant to uplift and shift out from Denby Main, when mum became mentally unwell. So she just took us out of school one day, and I never said goodbye or had an ending to the community that I lived in. I suppose now as an adult, I have a choice whether I go back there, and I suppose that's where my longing from. I suppose I never really left, my heart never really left Doncaster. My heart never really left Denby, so I go back there. I suppose for me it's healing, and it's also bringing ending to
Yeah,
things.
yeah, yeah. No, relationship to places is complicated, isn't it? I mean, I love Bolton. Bolton Wanderers is my football team, and I
Reebok,
only lived there really
Reebok.
when I was like 2.5 years of my life, I think, from like 7 till 9 or something. Before that, we lived in Bury, and then we lived in Durham, and but that 2 years for me, like I suppose when you're waking up actually as a human being, isn't it? You're becoming very self-conscious of the place you're in, and going to see Bolton play Middlesbrough.
They were at the
Great.
Reebok Stadium. I remember
Oh,
the
this is
Reebok.
before the
Oh, they're for the Reebok
Reebok
Stadium. I
Stadium.
remember
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Reebok Stadium, St Allardyce were there.
Yeah, yeah,
What were it called before
yeah. Well, I'm just now I'm embarrassing myself because I've forgotten Burndon Park. Burndon Park, I think it was called.
that?
Yeah, I didn't go there a lot because we then grew up in Durham. I did go back, and it had one time, and because in its poverty, it sold off a quarter of the stand or like a corner of the stand to a supermarket, so you didn't have seating there, and it had a big sign with Saurine malt loaf on the side, which I love Saurine malt loaf as well, so that made me very fond of Bolton. But
I think one of the things about community and especially neighbourhoods, is about the identity of the neighbourhood, the history of the neighbourhood. I know in Denver, if you didn't know about Pitts and Pitt Strike, you weren't, nobody were going to talk to you, nobody were letting you in.
Yeah.
And I think the beauty about neighbourhoods, they've all got their own identity.
Yeah.
They've all got the strengths. They've always got the person that everybody goes to for support. They've always got the little corner shop that everybody hangs around because they're lonely and got no one else to talk to. They're sitting in the shop.
Yeah.
There were always one pub that everybody went to on a Sunday, and there were always Sunday dinners. And I felt so communities and neighbours to me are something that I hold dear because yeah, it's very traditional for me, and I like to go back to tradition. I like that grounding and that stability of neighbourhoods where I feel that the strength in number and also in relationships and friendships and people married into communities, and there's something about it that there's a real of wealth of love, care and compassion.
Yeah, and it's funny, isn't it? So we've been doing this other work, Glenn, recently. I think I've told you a little bit about it before, but in Sheffield, where we are today, um, the I mean, a few years ago, I was thinking more about this idea of neighborhoods, but I was also thinking about this idea of democracy. And I started to think, well, how are you going to have a real democracy if people are not, if we're just voting for people every few years, sticking a little cross in a box, we don't really have a democracy. We don't really have people as citizens coming together, thinking together, making decisions together, acting together. We just have basically a kind of remote control democracy. We just tick a box and let other people take control of what's going on.
What does the word democracy mean? Because even the word democracy, until recently, was an alien word, it was a jargon word. So how would you describe what is a democracy?
Well, the Greek meaning, demos means people, and krasi means power. So you basically had a choice between monarchy, which means one person being in control, mono being one person, oligarchy, which means a few people being in control, and democracy, meaning we're all in control. That was the way in which the Greeks thought about it 2,500 years ago, and that these ideas have been discussed even before the Greeks. Um, and like so today in Britain, living in our system, you would say it's an oligarchy, really. We call it a democracy, that's what's confusing.
That's what I was going to
Yeah,
say.
but
It's
it's
confusing, isn't it?
technically it's an oligarchy. There are societies 2,500 years ago, like the city of Thebes, it had a system like ours. There were competing elite groups, and you would choose this group can now rule over us, or now this group can rule over us. Most people didn't get involved in things at all. But in Athens, where they really developed the idea of democracy, they said, well, all the citizens have to be involved in everything. And this is the critical point, they also said this isn't just happening over the whole big city, which is, you know, was like 250,000 people at the peak of Athens, but it has to happen at what they call the neighborhood level. So they had neighborhoods, which they called demis, and the neighborhoods are where people came together, sat down together, talked things over. I mean, to be fair, excluding women and excluding slaves and excluding young people. So it wasn't like perfectly inclusive, but still pretty exciting, like real democracy, like really people meeting and deciding things. And in communities around the world, Switzerland, Southern India, Iceland, you find this still exists. Real democracy still exists. We've just kind of we call ourselves like the home of democracy in Britain. We've kind of forgotten what it is, really.
I think the two things that stand out for me about neighbourhood when I really understood what a neighbourhood were, it happened every year in Denby. We had a big bonfire, community bonfire that everybody come round and everybody had hot dogs and onions and burgers. And I think the second thing in my youth that really brought on what a neighbourhood were, but I didn't realise that as a neighbour at the time, is when Princess Diana and King Charles got married,
Ah,
and we had street parties. And then memories there give me really good feelings, a good time.
yeah,
Because we all sat down together in a row, and
yeah,
all
yeah.
flags, everyone flying flags, and so I think the understanding of of neighbourhoods then were different to what it is now, but it was something very special.
I remember actually that reminds me of Nicola and I went. We love Nicola's family comes from Greece, and we went on holiday to Crete a few years ago, and it was Easter time, and we arrived, and the whole village where we arrived was out enjoying Easter, all eating together
In Greece.
in Greece.
Oh,
Yeah,
all right, I didn't know that.
so it was lovely to see going in and out of the church, but just it was a whole community experience. And I think food is one of the things that
Food,
unites people, eating
food, food,
together,
food. Yeah,
music connects
dancing,
people, yeah, dancing.
dancing, music.
So people, yeah, we've kind of lost a lot of our like ritual get-togethers, haven't we?
Yeah, yeah. And I think when I think about community, me, I mean, I don't know, I know exactly what a community is, but when I think about my community, the focal points of the community for in Derby when I grew up were the Catholic Church, it was the doctors, it were places of prestige, you know what I mean? Or places of where people naturally gathered together and had had good conversation. I think that's the big thing for me. So there might be lots of things that created a neighborhood, but for me, again, it was the crags. We had the crags where all the kids played, but there were certain things in that place what made it a neighborhood.
Mm. But what it's lacked, what all of the communities in the UK, almost all, lack is actually any power, any formal power,
Oh
any
yeah,
control over money. And actually what we've seen is lots of these neighborhoods have not only lost power, they've lost economic opportunities, they've lost social structures, they've lost the ability to kind of agree rules, define roles. Really, when I look at PFG in intake, I see really almost the hub of a democracy being created, kind of like not a formal democratic system. But if you think about what PFG is doing, people are coming, everybody's welcome, everybody's included.
eat together.
You eat together and you create opportunities to create festivals and celebrations and walks. There's opportunities for people also to then create roles like the community warden roles or people
Great
support roles,
employment, job
create
roles, job
projects. Yeah,
roles.
you're actually creating real jobs and
It's an
economic opportunities.
ecosystem, really.
And that's you need these kind of heartbeats in community that push action and energy around and capture everybody's interest. You can't like just expect things to get done if all you do is sit and watch the television and kind of complain that the council's not doing what it should do. The council can't do all the things a community can do. The council can do some things, but in the end of the day, we need a lot more things than just what the council can do to make a good functioning community. And that's why we really need to bring neighbourhoods to life, I think.
There's a lot of power within neighbourhoods. It's about harness the power of individual in that neighbourhood and about them individuals seeing themselves as powerful.
Yeah.
It's about bringing people in. It's about doing the things that we do on a daily basis to allow people to have a voice. A lot like you've said it about the way it has happened in other cultures and other countries, really. What do you think the next step is to building neighbourhoods and building community? How do you think it's going in today's society? Do you think there's a difference?
Well, I think we've gone through a long period of loss. I really do. I mean, you talked about the miners' strike earlier. Um, we in the northeast and Durham, where I lived, my mum was she used to volunteer at Samaritans, and she told I'd gone to some academic conference and I was telling her about this stuff, and there had been these people who'd been miners from Durham there, and she's saying, oh, she remembers how many calls they got from miners who'd lost their jobs and people committing suicide, thinking of committing suicide. And she said at the time there was a system for assessing the villages across the whole of County Durham, where they'd be graded from A, B to C. And a great, basically a C level village was the government wasn't going to do anything. The village was going to be allowed to die. So just imagine, I find that so shocking, that our political system just says, oh, well, these communities just We don't need them.
Well,
We don't care about the
Maggie
people in
Thatcher
them.
said there were no such thing as communities, didn't she?
Well,
Something
no
like
such thing as societies. They're
that.
just
Okay.
individuals. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Which I mean, I related that to community and
Yeah.
neighbourhoods, really.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right, Glenn. And, so that period, I think, was so destructive. But even before that, going back to, I mean, I'm a big fan of the welfare state, the NHS, things like this. But it's very strange. I mean, the National Health Service is a brilliant principle, but it's not clear to me why all of the power needs to sit in Whitehall.
No.
I mean, and at the time, there was an argument about it inside the Labour Party. Why do we have to have all of it run from Whitehall? Why couldn't local government control their own bit of the National Health Service? Why couldn't we have these services located locally? Why does all the power and money have to sit in London? So we've also seen not just a kind of, right wing destruction of community, but we have seen a bit of a left wing destruction of community too, because we've seen a kind of arrogance, I think,
Mm.
sometimes that the state's now got all the answers and the state is run from London. And therefore, just leave it to them. Just leave it to those nice, kind people in
Yeah.
London. And, that doesn't really work. I mean, the community needs its own engine room. The community needs its own kitchens. The community needs its own spaces where people can come together and work together. And we need that to happen at a small neighborhood level, because otherwise, just most of the work won't get done. Those big systems can't see the small things that matter to communities. They just can't see them. In some sense, it's not that they just don't care about them. They can't see them, Glyn.
But there weren't even any cohesion. We talk about community cohesion. The man strike destroyed that, destroyed families, destroyed people's lives. There were people just left with
Yeah,
arguing, and the families falling out because some had gone back to work and some
that's right. Yeah.
hadn't. And
Yeah.
I think for me that time were the worst I've seen neighbourhoods ever in my lifetime. I'm not saying there's not been other times, but for me, saw a social breakdown in communities and neighbourhoods. And but for me, living outside of communities for such a long, being in a mental health system and mental health institutions and all the other things I've been in, care homes and what have you. But now I come back into my neighbourhood, it was very hard to reconnect to that
Yeah.
neighbourhood because I felt like an imposter, even though I was from it. I felt like I'd been away from it that long, but that I didn't know how to uh, repatronize myself back into the
Yeah.
community. Things were so different.
That's very true, isn't it? It's very interesting how these like barriers of the distance
Distance,
get
yeah.
created very quickly, don't they?
Distances and people changing and places changing and familiarity of things and your assimilations to whatever around. You're looking for things that aren't there and looking for people who aren't there. And I felt very on the outside of neighbourhoods,
Yeah.
very on the outside of community. I wasn't. People never treated me that way, but that's the way that I felt. I was looking for the pointers of the woman who I was talking about who used to look after everybody on the street and she weren't there anymore. Obviously, people pass away, people die, people move on. And the neighbours that I left and the neighbour that I come back to had changed so much. I was actually grieving for the neighbourhood
Yeah.
that I left.
And it's funny as well. I don't know. That makes me think about like my parents, and particularly my dad, who grew up in Levenshulme, which is a part of a neighbourhood of Manchester, and which I uh, as a kid loved. Like it was a lovely place to be. There was a park just round the corner from my granny and granddad's. Brick terrace houses in Manchester, very typical Manchester houses, and very small but very friendly. Pop round to the corner shop, go into the park, putting greens, bowling greens, loads of things to do as a kid and for adults, and a very this is like in the 1970s, a very functioning community. For my dad, who'd gone to university, going back there, he didn't feel like he was part of it.
That's what I felt.
Yeah, so you could see that he felt like this was now a foreign world.
Yeah, alien.
And then by the 1980s, again, Thatcher had destroyed all of these things, so local government couldn't support any of them anymore, and they all started to dwindle away, and the community quickly became rather kind of, I mean, granny and granddad stayed there, did the best they could, but you could see it just declining at the 80s and the 90s. And I think now it's picked up again because there've been other changes. Um, but this is, I think that class thing's a big part of it. You we've always encouraged, we've always seen progress, or certainly the political system sees progress as almost getting people away from their neighborhood,
Yeah.
go to university, move to another town, move to another area of the country, move to a different country. We don't have an idea of how the community itself can develop. It doesn't think about how it offers jobs to kids and how it creates opportunities. And so, like, how does a young person feel in a neighborhood where it doesn't seem to be a kind of place where your future is being considered, really?
Well, you don't feel like you've got a place. I know when I've lived in Denby, which were classed as a deprived area. I lived in Eastwood, which was classed as a rundown deprived area, and that everybody was sent there with single parents, drug people with drug abuse, people who single parent families, people who aren't working. Probation dropped people off there. You never know who you were sleeping with. We were living through day by day because the people had moved out. People never stayed. But the point is, the neighbours themselves, because of the way they were treated, the way that they were seen, adopted that negative behaviour and
Yeah,
language and stereotype, and it were hard to break away. So as soon as you said you lived in some of these deprived areas, all of a sudden, ooh, people didn't want to talk to
yeah,
you, or they looked at you different, as though you was something wrong with you. If you'd been living from more affluent areas, you wouldn't have got the same response. So there was the social injustice by living in that neighbourhood, and I suppose living in that, I suppose I took all on a lot of those negative traits on which, again, were disempowering
yeah.
as a teenager and as an adult.
The funny thing is, in Sheffield, which has this huge diversity and inequality. So there are neighborhoods with a lot of economic disadvantage and a lot of suffering a lot of discrimination as well. And there's a big racial impact to this. So often it's people from different ethnic minority groups who have found themselves living in poorer parts of the city, and then they face double
Yeah.
disadvantage. Uh, but it's strangely, it's also those places where you find the most hope for the
Yes, definitely
future,
most of, yeah,
because
definitely most of.
people start to get organized, people start thinking differently. And when you then go to the really wealthy communities, a lot of them look a bit dead inside. It's quite interesting.
Soulless, very
Uh,
soulless, aren't they?
and so you find the really interesting examples of innovation are often in the most disadvantaged communities. It's a bit like, just generally, groups of people who are marginalized are often where the most energy for the future lies, really, I think. They're the ones who know what it is we really need. Whereas the people who are dripping in money and driving their BMWs to work and, you know, sitting in their nice house with behind the walls, they're in a bubble, really. They don't, they might think they've succeeded, but really they're in a bubble that's not going to guide us to where the future needs to
Certainly,
be.
certainly on my side, what I see is the most creativity, the most entrepreneurship comes out of the most deprived areas.
Yeah. What do you think we should be like? PFG and Citizen Network are working closely together on a lot of the neighbourhood work at the moment, Glyn. What do you think the priorities for neighbourhoods should be? What would you what would you put first on a list?
Helping communities and neighbours to see that they're assets, helping people to see that they're an ecosystem in themselves, helping people to gain back their power within that neighbourhood, helping people to challenge and right to the MPs, right to the people in power, right to the people who they need to be able to get funds dissolved back into that neighbourhood, enable that neighbourhood to take control of some finances and pick a topic, whether that's antisocial behaviour, whatever, and channel that. Have a community pub, have a community post office, have community wealth within that area. So it drives that community to have a voice and also to have an identity they chooses to have, not what's forced upon them.
Yeah, yeah, those are all good ideas. I mean, when we did that Fearless Cities thing together last year,
Yeah.
it's amazing. Again, you kind of feel like nobody's got all the answer,
No.
but if you look around, the answers are there, and
It,
it's
it,
almost putting together like a jigsaw
it
puzzle,
certainly
isn't it?
feels different. It feels like there's a new energy. It feels that there's more emphasis not back on neighbourhoods that I've never felt in my lifetime. Would you agree? Is that something
Yeah.
that you feel?
Yeah, and I think I was thinking about actually another funny stuff. I mean, I think that's true, but it's also interesting how, like here, we're here now today in a neighbourhood of Sheffield called Nether Edge, and this is a it's one of my friends calls it the lentil belt of Sheffield. So I think
What does that mean?
it means like it's kind of hippie, old people, relatively comfortably well off, but people who like muesli and lentils and vegetables.
Oh, I get you now.
Yeah,
I get what you
yeah.
mean now.
So the lentil belt of Sheffield. And not the wealthiest, but certainly not poor. It's got a lot of different groups in it. Actually, but anyway, we love it. Um, and we had this whole thing a year or so ago called the low traffic neighborhood, and there's this was actually, and this comes out of this idea that one of the things that we should be doing in is actually, which I think is a really good idea, is if we can get more things happening locally, then actually people don't need to travel as much. There doesn't need to be as much carbon burnt. Actually, it'd be better for the planet. People can take more care of the green spaces, that we don't need to be all running around so much, basically, in a way. And there's also this idea of a 15-minute community. So you can get to all them, you can get to what you need in your community in about 15 minutes, and you would walk there. So again, it'd be healthier and all of
Yeah.
these things. So these ideas are kind of bubbling away, and people are getting excited about them. But I got a phone call at the same time from somebody who was ferociously angry about the 15-minute community because she said what it was going to be a plot to trap us all in these communities, and the government was basically trying to stop us moving. And it really struck me that, although there is a lot of positive energy as well, like we're living at a time where there's a lot of fear. Like people are very fearful and very cynical and very angry. So even good things can quickly turn into quite bad
Yeah,
things, I
yeah,
think.
yeah.
So I think I think the opportunities are amazing, but we'll need to be working, helping people understand that we're not talking about locking people in
No.
neighborhoods. We can network the neighborhoods. Of course we can move between neighborhoods, but we want every neighborhood surely to flourish. Why do we can't have class C neighborhoods,
No.
can we, Glenn?
No, I think if I'm thinking about my ideal 15-minute neighbourhood, I would no matter which direction a parent went to, there were access to a school. I think for every which way we went in that 15-minute direction, and a nature reserve, a lake, something to walk around, a green space are really important to me. Getting back to nature, it's really good for my mental health and well-being. I'd love to go back to the old-fashioned shops that we had on every corner. We had a cobbler's, and we had a paper shop, and we had a butcher's. I get rid of all the corporate big organizations, so everybody bought local produce. There were local farmers. We bought local fresh eggs and milk and bread. I think that's if I had my dream, and I would want to get to, but that would be my 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And there are also community centres, there were leisure centres for fitness. But the point I'm saying is, it's all were based on what the community wanted and what the community needed and what the community designed for that environment.
Yeah, and I think that's so important. I think the economic bit is really important. Like we need to see more money spent back in our own neighborhoods on local people's small businesses. And I definitely think we could do with a lot less supermarkets, a lot less brands, a lot more local entrepreneurship, and a lot more grown locally, farmed locally, and connections to local farmers who are outside the neighborhoods
Mm.
made much more real. I think we need to get back to some basics around.
Local jobs for local people. And people, instead of people then moving 20, 30, 50, 80, 100 mile away out of that community, bring some stability back in that community because they stay in that community because there's jobs and there's money economic for people to be able to live and to be able to thrive and instead of surviving and I mean buying houses and the economy and everything that you need in that small area would be there for that person not thinking, I know what there's not for me. I need to move to London or move to Manchester or move to whatever. Really investment in it, really investment in the place. And also by that investment in the place, there won't be any antisocial behaviour because people want to look after the place that they live in. There won't be any crime because people want to look after the name, they don't want to commit a crime. All the problems that we have in each community at the minute because people have got a vested interest and they've brought generation up to generation after generation in them communities. They want to preserve what they've created.
I think what I'd like to see in my ideal neighborhood, and it sounds a bit boring, but it shouldn't be boring, is like big spaces that we can use together. So a big space where we could have a concert,
Yes.
a big
Yes, yes,
space
yeah,
where we could have an exhibition, a big space where people can meet together democratically. I
yeah.
think, what is really striking is that it's very hard now to find those big spaces. Lots of things have been privatized, closed off. You can only get them if you've got lots of money.
Well, they made them into houses.
Yeah.
Made them into housing complexes, aren't
So we need big public spaces if we're going to be citizens, I think. And even to have fun. Like there's so much talent out there. You could have concerts and events going on all the time in our neighborhoods. There's enough talent in a neighborhood to be doing all sorts, but we kind of force that out as
they? Yeah.
well, really.
I'd like to see people eating together on every street.
Yeah, see,
Down every
yeah,
street, people eating on a Sunday dinner or just having a festival or a jamboree and just sat there breaking bread, talking to each other
yeah,
in good conversation, connecting up in back into community, and supporting the neighbours. Be supporting the neighbours. So somebody can't duck garden, so they don't do the gardening, but they can't bake or cook, so they'll cook them the dinner. They can't write, so they'll write them a letter while they paint their fence. They're back to the old traditional values, the old community support within neighbourhoods
yeah.
like we had. That's what I'd love to get back to.
I think that the food is such a good way of thinking about this, isn't it? Eating together. That's a company. The word company means uh, with bread,
Mm.
and that's I think one of the things we need to think about. So that's a good point to wind up. I think let's encourage folk. Hope that you've enjoyed Glyn and I chatting about neighborhoods.
Yes.
Think about your own neighborhoods, get involved in some of the things that are going on locally, and also connect up maybe with the neighborhood democracy movement and citizen network, and look into some of the cool stuff that PFG are doing in intake. And we hope to see you soon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.